Former Prime Minister Kim Campbell is this year's recipient of the famous 5 nation-building awards. She joins me here in the studio. Welcome and congratulations.
Thank you very much.
It's amazing. Let's just get some general thoughts. What's intriguing you about Canadian politics these days?
Well, what's intriguing me is that the number of women in Parliament still seems to be kind of stuck. Yep. And I think we need to jolt that and do something dramatic and interesting about that. Mm-hmm. I've actually just returned to Canada to work here. I'm setting up the Peter Lougheed Leadership College at the University of Alberta. So I'm also kind of re-immersing myself in politics in a better way. So if you ask me in another few months, I'd probably have a better answer. But, you know, in some ways it's same old, same old. In some ways, you know, I mean, scandals in the Senate are kind of interesting. It's a variation on a theme from my day. But, and also what's interesting to me is how much bigger the House of Commons is getting. It was 285 seats when I was there. So
right now, 338 is going to be.
Yeah,
next election.
Yeah, so
that's amazing. I'm sure you took great, not maybe Joyce was talking about, but you were pretty happy when we had 5 women premiers. Yeah. Over 80% of the country's population under women. Now we're down to 2. Does that bother you? Do you think that says anything?
Well, I think it's a pity, although still 2 large provinces have women premiers. And again, you know, the idea is not to, you know, entrench women there all the time. I mean, they have to, you know, lead their parties and fight the political battles like anybody else, certainly as I did in '93. But what's great about having women in those positions is that it affects the landscape from which people derive their sense of how the world works. And so traditionally, provincial premiers have not gone on to be prime minister. But our level of comfort with women in those positions increases when we see them. I mean, you can't sort of imagine it in the abstract, because when you do, then somebody comes along and all of a sudden there's all the old preconceptions that you have to overcome. So I'm sorry that there aren't 5 there, but I am glad that there are at least 2 in provinces where they get a fair amount of profile.
That's true. They were the famous 5 here just last year, but you know, unfortunately they've gone on. Let me ask you though about women prime ministers. You were the only one that's ever been in that category. 147 years. You must look at this and say 147 years is too long to wait to get elected a woman as prime minister.
Well, it is, and one of the things that I'm arguing is that we need to take proactive steps to increase the number of women in the House of Commons, to create gender parity. You know, other countries are way ahead of us. You know, they have the countries that have proportional representation, and the parties have alternate men and women on their list, so that however many seats they win, the caucuses are evenly divided. We can't really do that. I know Equal Voice, whom I admire enormously, proposes that, but I think changing our system to a proportional representation is very unlikely to happen. And I've argued that the best way to achieve gender parity is simply to make all of our constituencies 2-member constituencies and elect a man and a woman from each of them. And before you go, that would never work. Well, when I was in the British Columbia legislature, I was elected from a 2-member constituency. The Vancouver and Victoria's ridings were 2-member ridings. Eventually they changed those because the rural ridings were 1 members, but there's no reason you can't do that. And then you still have grassroots nomination. You don't have men and women fighting each other. You go to the polls, you have 2 lists of candidates. You elect 1 man, 1 woman, and maybe a party ticket. It may not be. You can choose however you like. The United States Senate is a 2-member constituency body. There's no reason why you can't do that. And you wouldn't double the number of seats in the House of Commons. You'd have, you know, a famous Canadian commission to redraw the boundaries. But, you know, the point I was making about how big House of Commons is now, it's already grown considerably. And, you know, the House of Representatives in the United States has been frozen at 425 for decades. So there, you know, there's no kind of optimal number of people that are represented by 1 member. And now with, you know, social media and internet and whatever, it changes dramatically the ability of somebody to represent people. So I think you could do that. I think you'd have instant parity. Party leaders, male or female, would have big farm teams from both sexes. You could get really the best, good balance, men and women not fighting each other, but collaborating in the best of all possible worlds.
Interesting idea. I hadn't heard that one before. All right, I want to get some of your resumes, got some interesting areas, particularly as how it relates to the current state of affairs. You were on the International Center for Study of Radicalization and Political Violence. How does Canada and the U.S. stop being this export country for these jihadists that go over there and join groups like ISIS? It just makes no sense.
Well, it's interesting. ICSR grew out of the Madrid summit in 2005 on democracy, terrorism, and security. And one of the things that came out of that, this was the Club of Madrid convened this huge meeting. One of the things that came out was that we hadn't been doing enough research on radicalization. So I'm a trustee of this body out of King's College, and they're doing wonderful work. Incidentally, the government of Canada is supporting them them and enjoying the fruits of their research. It's complicated, and I think, you know, we're seeing a lot of things. You may not want to relate that to the Scottish referendum, but there is a way in which people are kind of looking for identity, and you know, these movements have always had an attraction. I mean, I'm a child of the 60s, when a lot of, you know, nice middle-class kids who grew up with everything became radicals, became anarchists, you know, and horrified their parents by, you know, denouncing them and running off and, you know, joining communes and things. I think there is always that kind of tendency of people looking for meaning. And that's when we have to look at, you know, what are our opportunities in society. I don't know if we'll ever be able to fully do away with it. This kind of identity seeking is particularly worrisome because it is kind of murderous in its intention, because it takes its underlying philosophy to justify killing people and killing enemies, as opposed to just denouncing them and sending them off to the gulag. So it's scary. But I think that intelligence and tackling these things, nipping them in the bud as much as you can, and the policy about what you do with people who come back from jihadist activities. You know, there was a time when one lost one's citizenship if you bore arms for another country. And I think we have to think about what is the appropriate way to deal with.
They're going to take their passport away from them. That's at least one step. Maybe the next is citizenship. Final question. You know, I got to ask you. It's inevitable. How worried should the Conservatives in Canada be about Justin Trudeau, in your view?
Well, you know, politics is a very complex thing, and, you know, Justin Trudeau has, for some people, you know, a famous name and a kind of magic name, and I think without that, I don't think he'd be where he is now. However worthy he is, I think there's no question that that made a difference. And, you know, I think there's two things that are a challenge to the Conservative government. One is support for their policies and their ability to persuade people that they are, in fact, the best hand on the tiller. And that they'll have to do. And that I think Justin Trudeau is irrelevant to that, really. And the key is if he is seen as a viable alternative. And I think one of the approaches that the Conservatives have taken is to argue that he's not really a viable alternative. So then what does that mean for Mr. Mulcair and the NDP? But the second thing is also that, you know, there's also a tendency sometimes for people just to want change and alternation, the notion. So political parties are constantly challenged to present themselves as renewed, and, you know, so that it's not just always same old, but it's, you know, good hand on the tiller, but with some new and fresh ideas. You know, it's good to renew our mandate because we have these new wonderful things to do. And that will be their challenge. And I think they're in that mode now because the election has been promised for 2015. So I think for Justin Trudeau, you know, to the extent the government cannot overcome criticism, he just has to sit and hope to reap the benefit. But on another sense, that he needs to make the argument for change, and if he succeeds in doing that, he'll be more of a peril.
You know, you were a victim of the desire for change.
Yes,
so,
I certainly was.
I think you deserve more than 132 days, but
well,
that's the way it works.
Time is everything. There's no question about it.
Kim Campbell, thanks for coming in. We appreciate
My
it.
pleasure.
Congratulations again on the award.
And folks, this is for real. It is gorgeous.
It is.
What a view.